It's another beautiful week, and I am more than happy to be back on your screens. You're welcome to this edition of China Now. My name is Makiza Latifa. Let me start you off with China Currents with Kris, who has a host of topics to present to you on trending news that happened in China this week. This includes an update on Anthony Blinken's visit to China, which touched on a range of bilateral, regional, and global issues, including the Middle East, the war in Ukraine, the South China Sea, and the Taiwan Straits. The show will also highlight the visit of the Malaysian Foreign Minister to China, which experts say will pave the way for future high-level exchanges between the two countries. Over to you, Kris.
China Currents is a weekly news talk show from China to the world. We cover viral news about China every week and also give you the newest updates on China's cutting-edge technologies. Let's get started.
Welcome to China Currents. I'm Kris. The top trending news this week is undoubtedly U.S. Secretary of State Anthony Blinken's visit to China, which starts on April 24th in Shanghai. But the drama of Blinken's visit started even earlier, before his physical appearance in China. Prior to the visit, U.S. officials adopted their usual tactic of using harsh language to apply pressure on China, expressing the so-called strong concerns about China's support for Russia and the Taiwan question. Chinese observers stated that the recent frequent visits of Blinken, as well as a string of other U.S. officials, indicate that Washington is unable to solve domestic and global issues without cooperation from China. Therefore, when seeking help from Beijing, the U.S. will be wise to communicate with China respectively and as equals, rather than condescendingly. According to the U.S. State Department spokesman Matthew Miller, Blinken would discuss a range of bilateral, regional, and global issues, including the Middle East, the war in Ukraine, the South China Sea, and the Taiwan Straits. He will also talk about progress made in resuming counter-narcotics cooperation, military-to-military communication, artificial intelligence, and strengthening people-to-people ties, and will reaffirm how important it is for the U.S. and China to be responsibly managing competition even in areas where our two countries disagree. On April 24th, U.S. Secretary of State Anthony Blinken arrived in Shanghai to begin the second official visit to China of his tenure. Blinken is scheduled to travel to China from Wednesday to Friday, where he will meet with senior Chinese officials in both Shanghai and Beijing to talk about a range of bilateral, regional, and global issues. Some Western media also hold a cautious view of this visit. The New York Times said Blinken goes to China with potential trouble on horizon, as the visit comes as Democrats and Republicans are vying to appear tougher on China. Reuters said Blinken arrived with bilateral ties on a steadier footing, but with a daunting array of unresolved issues threatening the stability of relations between the two countries. The Associated Press also listed the major divisions between China and the U.S. and key issues that Blinken is going to bring up on the trip, including the Russia-Ukraine conflict, tensions in the Middle East, the Taiwan question, and the South China Sea issue. Just before Blinken boarded his plane, the North America and Oceania Department of China's Ministry of Foreign Affairs briefed the media on Monday, providing a 3,000-plus word statement about the details of the visit. It not only reiterated a welcoming attitude, but also elaborately outlined the 5 main objectives of the visit, including establishing correct perceptions, enhancing dialogue, effectively managing differences, advancing mutually beneficial cooperation, and jointly undertaking the responsibilities of a major country. Experts said that the briefing has also considered a negotiating memorandum provided to Blinken. Next up, Malaysian Foreign Minister Dato Seri Utama Haji Muhammad bin Haji Hassan arrived in Beijing on Tuesday for a 3-day visit to China, his first visit to the country since he took the post in December 2023. Chinese experts said this visit could pave the way for future high-level exchanges between the two countries and also aim to implement a series of consensus reached by the two heads of state in 2023. Some experts hailed China-Malaysia relations as exemplary and pragmatic among China's relations with ASEAN countries. Despite changes in the Malaysian government since 2018, the major direction of cooperation between China and Malaysia has not been significantly impacted. Malaysia's stance on the South China Sea issue is relatively pragmatic and moderate, emphasizing dialogue concerning this issue, which will also send out a positive signal to the region, especially when the Philippines continue to provoke tensions under the U.S. instigation. Next up, senior naval officers from around the world on Monday witnessed the opening of a naval symposium in China, which is aimed at bridging differences and seeking global governance on maritime issues. While a senior Chinese defense official reaffirmed China's commitment to resolving disputes with directly involved countries through friendly consultations, but also vowed countermeasures against unwarranted provocations. The 19th Western Pacific Naval Symposium opened on Monday in the port city of Qingdao in East China's Shandong province, and Zhang Youxia, vice chairman of the Central Military Commission, attended the event and delivered a speech. Zhang said that China's armed forces have actively participated in international cooperation of maritime security and provided maritime public security goods, adding that China will play a more positive and open role in international military cooperation. He said that we should resolutely abandon the Cold War mentality, join hands to create peace and stability, bridge differences through dialogue and consultation, jointly discuss and establish rules for governance, and push maritime security governance to a new level with practical results. Next up, flood-affected areas in South China on Monday called for an all-out effort to reduce the impact brought about by the heavy rainfall during recent days, including transferring residents, strengthening monitoring frequency, and issuing early warnings to safeguard people's lives and property, and preventing secondary disasters such as landslides caused by heavy rainfall. China's National Meteorological Center on Monday issued a yellow alert for rainstorm and a blue alert for severe convection weather as heavy downpours as well as thunderstorms, gales, and hail are anticipated to lash parts of the country, including parts of South China's Guangdong province and Guangxi Zhuang Autonomous Region from Monday to Tuesday. China has a 4-tier weather warning system, with red being the most severe, followed by orange, yellow, and blue. China's State Flood Control and Drought Relief Headquarters and the Ministry of Emergency Management on Monday continued to coordinate and deploy flood control and disaster relief work in key areas in South China and other regions to cope with the new round of heavy rainfall. Next up, last Sunday, Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi wrapped up his visit to Papua New Guinea with a meeting with Prime Minister James Marape, confirming mutual interest of speeding up cooperation in broad fields, which analysts said will inject more vitality into the South Pacific region. The mutually beneficial cooperation between the two countries has been expanding and deepening, providing a steady stream of impetus for their respective development and revitalization. And in the process of PNG's development, China will be your most reliable partner, Wang told Marape on Sunday. And Chinese observers noted that the productive discussions between the two sides highlights the warmer ties between the island country and China. And they cautioned against the U.S. attempts to stir discord between China and the PNG, emphasizing that the tangible benefits derived from partnering with China in the region cannot be overlooked by local government and the people. Next up, Chinese President Xi Jinping, in a congratulatory letter to the first China, Latin American and Caribbean States Space Cooperation Forum on Wednesday, highlighted that China is ready to work with Latin America and Caribbean countries to build a high-level space cooperation partnership to promote space technology to better benefit both peoples and continue to promote the building of a community of China and the Latin American and Caribbean countries with a shared future. The event, co-hosted by the China National Space Administration and Hubei Provincial Government, took place in Wuhan, Hubei Province on Wednesday. The forum holds great significance in inspiring space scientific innovation, deepening international space cooperation, and showcasing the high level of political trust between China and the Latin America, Caribbean countries. Noting that this year marks the 10th anniversary of the establishment of the China CELAC Forum, jointly announced by the leaders of the two sides. Xi said that China and Latin American and Caribbean countries have seen prosperous development over the past decade in their cooperation in various fields within the framework of the China CELAC Forum to usher in a new era featuring equality, mutual benefit, innovation, openness, and tangible benefits for the people. She said that China is ready to work with Latin American and Caribbean countries to build a high-level space cooperation partnership, promote space technology to better benefit both peoples, and continue to promote the building of a community of China and the Latin American and Caribbean countries with a shared future. Last but not least, the Chinese People's Liberation Army Navy held open day events in multiple coastal cities across China around Tuesday to mark the 75th anniversary of its founding, with numerous people getting on board advanced warships to enjoy the moment of pride and patriotism with naval officers. Military experts said the Chinese Navy will keep developing and getting more powerful in the future to meet the demand of safeguarding the nation and the world peace. April 23rd marks the 75th anniversary of the PLA Navy. From Saturday to Wednesday, the public in Qingdao will be able to tour the missile destroyers Guiyang, Shijiazhuang, and Kaifeng, and missile frigate Handan, supply ship Kekeshili-hu, and submarine rescue vessel Hongze-hu at a Pier 3 and the Qingdao International Sailing Center Pier. Most of the naval vessels have been involved in major missions such as escort missions in the Gulf of Aden authorized by the UN Security Council, overseas port visits, and joint exercises. And that's all for today. Thank you for watching this episode of China Currents. If you have any thoughts and comments about our show, please reach us at the email address below. I'm Kris. Looking forward to hearing from you, and see you next time.
We are most grateful to you, Kris, for the updates. But that does it for China Currents with Kris. Let's now do the Thinkers Forum, where we take diverse opinions on world trends from our thinkers and scholars who have so much knowledge to share with us. Robert Atkinson is the founder and president of the Information Technology and Innovation Foundation, and he will be discussing a host of issues in the first part of the segment. So stay with us.
There's a view among most sort of foreign policy establishment leaders in the U.S. that China is seeking to be the global hegemon, just like the U.S. has been the global hegemon. Look, at the end of the day, I think China will become very, very much more powerful than it is now. There's all this discussion in the U.S. The Chinese economy is stagnating in the birth rate and all that. I don't buy that. China is going to continue to grow significantly. The Chinese economy will be double in 25 years. I'm completely convinced of that. And so no matter what you do, China is going to be a major player in the world economy. It's going to have a lot of power. And I don't think that we can do anything about that, nor in some way should we do anything about that. What I worry about is not so much that, but that rise, and I think this is what a lot of American leaders think, is that rise comes at the expense of our advanced industries, where we really lose a lot and China gains a lot. We've long had export restrictions for many countries, including the Soviet Union and others, where we think that the technology could be used for creating weapon systems. Where it gets a little fuzzier is where we're putting export bans on technologies, particularly like semiconductor chips. And no one can deny that one of the effects of that is to hurt our own companies. Our own companies now have fewer sales. That means they probably will invest slightly less in research and development and developing the next generation of chips. So in a way, there's a phrase in the US or in the West called cutting your nose off to spite your face. We're cutting our nose off because we could be selling more. I believe the same thing with AI and cloud computing restrictions. That's not to say we should go whole hog and go crazy. So look, ultimately, China is going to be able to make those chips. And so I worry that we're not really getting any real benefit. Maybe we're throwing some sand on barriers in the road for a little bit, but not really fundamentally making a big dent. Well, the old Washington consensus was really around this idea that we would spread this kind of free market, open trade, fiscal discipline to all these countries around the world. And if they just kind of copied us, they would develop quickly and all. It was a response to some countries being so far off the, like Brazil being totally protectionist and Argentina running up massive, massive budget deficits and then their currency falling and in massive inflation. Okay, countries need to have good macroeconomic stability in their policy. You need to have somewhat openness to trade. I get all that. The problem with the Washington Consensus today is it really doesn't give countries a path by which they can grow their economies. It's just don't do these bad things and these wonderful things will happen. And the problem today is that countries know that that's not enough. They have to be more proactive. And what I worry about is if the West comes in and says, hey, don't do these bad things. And China comes in and says, hey, wait a minute, here are these good things you can do. You can build up your infrastructure. You can help train your workers. You can install these really good technology, and we will help you do that. What I worry about is then it sort of puts countries in a like, yeah, I like that one better. I'm going to go in that direction, and so it just leads a lot of countries to then go and say, well, we really like the Chinese model, and we're going to be more aligned with China. And I think the reality is, the Washington Consensus was never a good model for developing countries. So I think as long as the West keeps sort of proselytizing this market-based view, we're just going to lose countries because they're like, I don't want to do that. I want to follow Korea. I want to follow China. They look at China and they go, I really like that. I mean, you look at China 40 years ago, incredible poverty, millions of bicycles and no cars. Now it's incredible, EVs and all this stuff. So I think Washington and the West has to come up with another model for how to grow. And that's what I would say, reject the Washington Consensus. But I do think a lot of countries look to China and say, how do I grow my manufacturing? How do I become moving up the value chain the way China has? So, and also the other thing about China, I would say, I give China credit for this, is they put a lot of effort into this. They really reach out to a lot of developing countries and say, what can we do? The US doesn't do that as much anymore. To be fair, there's no real sort of coherent strategy for how to respond to China. It's very ad hoc. Now people are worried about electric vehicles. There's obviously this focus on export controls. So it's not really systematic. There's no real sort of overarching plan or strategy. As I said, the main thing I would do before is I would make it harder for Chinese companies that are systematically not playing by the rules. I would make it harder for them to get access to our market. If Chinese companies are playing by the rules, I'm like, great, that's not a problem. And I do think that level of nuance, if you will, is what's needed in the U.S. debate. It tends to be either let's do nothing or let's go overboard and kill TikTok and do everything and 100% tariff. And I think there's a difference between where China is currently competitive, including being an innovation leader or close to the lead, and areas where they're not, but they're catching up. But robots is in that second category. The world's leading robot producers still are in Germany, Sweden, Switzerland, and Japan. I would argue, though, China's catching up very, very quickly in robotic innovation. They're certainly leading in terms of just putting robots in factories. So I just wrote a report on Chinese robotics capabilities, and China is adopting way more robotics in manufacturing than we are, and their robotics R&D is very, very far along. And so they have this center. I'm sorry, I forget the name of the town, but it's a beautiful campus, and robotics companies are all around it, and the government's putting in money to do research on robotics. Anyway, so those kind of things, just to be clear, I give China a lot of credit for that. That's a good way to compete. You're competing on just, can we get better? Can we innovate? And I don't think ultimately, there's some people in the US who would just say, well, we don't want China to do any of that. China's doing very well there. I think obviously telecom equipment with Huawei and ZTE to some extent. Electric vehicles, I think, are, it's not clear where, if China's better than, like, say, Tesla, China, like BYD and other companies, but they're certainly pretty far advanced, and they're coming at it with a low price. I think in a lot of areas, China is still behind. I think, for example, on biotechnology and pharmaceuticals, China is still behind the West. But again, making significant progress. So I think what's likely to happen in the next decade, China went from very much an agrarian and kind of not very good manufacturing economy up to a very good manufacturing economy. It's pretty long-standing when at a point where countries are competing on sort of lower skills and lower prices. I don't think that's an attitude anymore in the US. Oh, made in China, it's not very good. That perhaps was when China was at the lower end of the production scale and their products weren't as high quality oftentimes. That's not what's happening in China now. I think the next step that where China is going, I believe that they will get there, is really getting a lot better in these more complicated, complex production systems and technologies. So, these glasses I'm wearing, they're from China. They're great glasses, reading glasses. They're super cheap. They're not very hard to make. But making an airplane, incredibly hard to make. Making medical devices, really high-end, complex medical devices, really hard to make. And that's where China is going, and that's where they want to go. And there's a lot of, I think, advantages China has there. One is you're graduating a significantly higher number of engineers and scientists than we are. If you look at the Chinese research articles that published scholarly scientific research articles in terms of the most cited in the world. So, anybody can publish a research article, not very hard. But getting one that's cited a lot means it's really important. And if you look at what the Australian Strategic Policy Institute, ASPI, has done, they did an analysis of the trend in Chinese scholarly publications and how well cited they are. It's amazing. I mean, I think that's the other thing that people are not fully appreciating in the West is that how well the science base of China has improved. It still has a long way to go, but Chinese science has gotten significantly better, and engineering has been strong. So, I think China should be quite proud of what it's accomplished there. So again, it's really across the board. But overall, I do think China is making fairly robust progress in a lot of these areas. I do think one of the advantages that China has now is that if you look at the opinion polling that some international organizations have done about sort of the attitude of the population towards science, technology, growth, innovation, I do think China has an advantage in a way because first of all, China is more hungry, like, hey, we still want this. And then secondly, I do think there's a more pro-innovation attitude among Chinese people. I was just talking to somebody yesterday on a call, and they were talking about how they were in a restaurant in maybe Shanghai. A robot delivered the food. I do think that's an advantage. China, as long as China keeps this sort of, hey, we want to be innovative, we want to keep pushing the envelope, that's a plus. You really need that as a country to be able to keep innovating and improve. So I do think that's one thing China has that's really an advantage over us. I think there is a space for sort of co-prosperity there where, we could acknowledge, of course, China is going to be, a much bigger economy in 25, 30, 40 years. And as part of that, have a much bigger role on the global stage. It's more, is that going to come with, our significant weakening and harm? So I do think that's one of the other factors that's going on. When you look at international trade theory or international economics, one of the reasons it's supposed to work is because of market forces. And a key market force is when a country's products become less competitive in global markets, either because of domestic inflation or their companies aren't as productive, the natural market adjustment process is for the currency to fall. And then when you want to buy, an American machine tool, you pay, instead of paying, the equivalent of 100,000 yuan, you only pay 90,000 yuan, and now you're more likely to buy it. And conversely, when we would buy, say, a Chinese made wind turbine, we would pay instead of $10,000, we'd pay 11,000. Problem is in the U.S. that we have this, I would call it an ideology. It's an ideology of a strong dollar. And it's weird because the US is very market oriented. We want the market to determine many things except the value of the dollar. Now, I think ultimately the US dollar is significantly overvalued because we're running a $1 trillion trade deficit. So the dollar needs to fall 20% minimum, 30% minimum. The reason it doesn't fall is because it's the reserve currency. And so everybody in the world trusts it and they all put their money into dollars. And then the other problem is that the U.S. Elites, all the economists, the financial system, Wall Street, they love a strong dollar, and the national security establishment likes a strong dollar. And so some of the tensions would go away if we were having more balanced trade with China. Again, there are many factors, but I think that's one of the factors. And a weaker dollar, so let's put it that way, would do a lot for making the U.S. more competitive. I'm not at all optimistic that U.S. policymakers will do that. They're allergic to that. But ultimately, the global financial markets might do it because our budget deficits are so bad. Our national debt is so big. Eventually, currency holders around the world might say, well, we're not going to put the money into the dollar as much anymore. We might put it in the euro, or we might put it in the RMB, or wherever that might be. The Biden administration, they won't support a weaker dollar or a market-adjusted dollar. I do think a Trump administration might do that. Part of the reason I say that is to start advocating for a market-adjusted dollar is a very bold thing to do in U.S. politics. Whoever advocates that will be criticized a lot, and there'll be a lot of political pressure. It's not clear, obviously, if Mr. Trump will become president again, but if he is, there's some talk about perhaps Mr. Robert Lighthizer, who was the head of our trade negotiating body, might become Treasury Secretary. I think if that happens, he would advocate for a weaker dollar because he understands that very well. So I think a dollar adjustment is more likely under a Trump administration. We might see that, but I think under a Biden administration, we'll just see the status quo.
Next on the Thinkers Forum is a discussion around China's economy, as a lot of foreign media platforms continue to utilize topics like industrial transfer and consumption decline to render the Chinese economy as collapsing. So let's now hear from one of the leading scholars in China-EU economic relations, Haico Ebbers, who doubles as a professor of international economics at Nyen Road Business University, to present his expert analysis on this and why he is still very confident in the Chinese economy.
I think we should separate long and short-term drivers behind economic growth. As an economist, I always indicate that beforehand, because if you talk about economic growth, it can be driven by short-term factors like consumption, export and government spending, but also economic growth is driven by supply-side factors like productivity, efficiency, innovative behavior. So it all depends which factor is creating this economic growth. If it is a factor like consumption that is under attack at the moment, then it is very cyclical. It's only for 1 year or 1 quarter or maybe 2 quarters. If it would be a more supply-side picture with lower growth of the productivity or lower growth of efficiency, then that would be more of a problem. So I think it is a short-term cyclical problem driven by spending components, which in the medium term is less of importance than what you see in the media at the moment. It may change in a couple of quarters in the near future. You also have longer term drivers behind economic growth like efficiency and productivity growth and innovative behavior and so forth. And these drivers are still quite positive and robust in most of the statistics on China. And not very pessimistic that this 5.2% economic growth is low and may become lower. If I look at the longer term drivers, I'm quite optimistic on China. And clearly there are cyclical factors which may have a negative impact for 1 or 2 quarters, but that's very, very short term. The middle income trap is the trap that countries are staying in a middle income level for many decades, because it is relatively easy to move from a poor country to a middle income country. You can execute all kinds of measures to create economic growth. I call that easy economic growth, by putting more people in the market, by stimulating government expenditures, exporting low value added products. That's relatively easy to have economic growth from these drivers. But then the trap is that you are not executing reforms. And one of the reforms is that you have to upscale, you have to increase, you have to move from low value added activities to high value added activities, from low skilled labor export to much more higher skilled labor production. And that relates to all these new industries we see in China booming at the moment. And I think that is a key precondition for having the possibility to restructure the society towards a high income level, and therefore to escape the middle income trap. If we look at success stories of countries that were able to escape the middle income trap and to move to a high income level, like Singapore, like South Korea, then the main learning point there is you need structural reforms. For that, to be able to do that, you need to invest in the educational system. You need to have a sort of innovative context, innovative network, an innovative ecosystem. You have to find the optimum way of competing to each other and working together with each other by putting a combined government, business and the universities together into, for example, a high-tech cluster. The second question is China able to execute it? Now, if you look at fundamental research as a driver for innovative behavior, of course, we have pioneers like the US and certain countries in Europe. But I really question the paradigm that innovation, that type of innovation is needed. I think all kinds of other innovations are extremely helpful. You can think about process innovation, and you can talk about the more engineered innovation instead of the real R&D. And in that sense, I'm quite optimistic that still for the next 10 years, or maybe even 20 years, and even the OECD indicate for the next 30, 40 years, there's an increase in productivity and hence innovative behavior, because it is relatively easy for countries like China to use today's technology to increase efficiency. So the focus on fundamental research, I think, is sometimes a little bit overestimated, a little bit overemphasized. Be aware of the fact that for international trade, the most important innovation was the container. The container was the most important driver which made international trade more efficient. And that is not really high-tech innovation. So in that sense, innovation as a term is maybe too broad. If you narrow down, then we can fine-tune easy steps to increase innovative behavior without fundamental R&D. Now there is clearly much more sensitivity on China. Companies are trying to mitigate the risk related to China. One way, for example, is by moving part of production outside China. I don't see that happening a lot, but there's clearly a trend that they are shifting part of production, for example, to India or to Vietnam. Like we see with the iPhone at the moment, where all the iPhones were produced in China, and now we see part of the iPhones are being also produced in India. So it is the China Plus strategy that we see happening in terms of supply chains globally. The impact on China is depending on how we look at the export sector. China is export driven, and because of that we see this huge economic growth in the previous years. But I'm not sure whether that is the correct answer. Because if you look at for example, the iPhone, to be able to export one iPhone, you have to import a lot of components before able to export the iPhone. So if you look at the real value added of the iPhone produced in China, that's not so high. Maybe about $15 per iPhone is adding towards GDP, while the export of the iPhone per iPhone is maybe $1,000. So in a sense, China is less sensitive to export than what we mostly feel in Europe and the US because of this export-import relationship. So if export is going down, it's not always the case that the economy is being hurt. In particular, if export of electronics are being produced in China, but all the components are being imported towards China. So in that sense, a lower export does not have so much negative impact. So I think the effect on changes in the global supply chain is related to the structure of the export pattern related to this supply chain. And if low-skilled labor activities related to the supply chain is being moved to countries like Vietnam or India, I think that's a good sign for China for the longer term, because you cannot grow in the longer term based on low-skilled labor. You have to make the adjustment to much more high-skilled labor. And mostly these global supply chains are still related in many cases to low-skilled labor. Now it is clear that globalization is under attack. Many countries don't believe anymore so much in the IMF or the World Trade Organization, so they have a problem with these multilateral institutions. We see a rise of protectionism. We see an explosion of industrial policy in many parts of the world, like the Green Deal in Europe or the Inflation Reduction Act in the US. So that type of protectionism is rising. This is not new. Already in the 1970s, we had all kinds of industrial policy in the West, because it's clear that if you are moving from relatively low-skilled to a more high-skilled society, the market will not solve that. Market forces are not able to solve this transformation. You need a government interference to have this transformation happening. So it is quite logical that if you want to change into new innovative sectors, that government interference is needed, and hence a type of industrial policy is needed. That is even independent on geopolitical reasons. This is an economic way of explaining why industrial policy is happening. Now it is being accelerated clearly by geopolitical reasons, in which the US wants to be less dependent on China, and that Europe wants to be less dependent on China. But there is an economic logic behind it, and I think this will continue for the next coming years, for sure. It's not the case that protectionism will win above free trade. We still believe in free trade, but also we believe in sometimes we have to protect ourselves because of the negative disruptions of free trade. Because free trade can also be sometimes unfair. And you want to protect your labor market. We believe in a positive-sum game. There are winners and winners in international trade. But sometimes we feel that we need strategic autonomy. And to create strategic autonomy, in a sense, means sometimes you have to increase protectionism. So I think it is a trend which will stay there for a while. But again, it is not that we don't believe in free markets. We still believe in free markets. But sometimes you need some additional government interference and protectionism.
And that does it for the Thinkers Forum and by extension today's edition of China Now. Please do not forget to send in your comments, thoughts, feedback and suggestions for the coming episodes of the show through the email provided below. My name is Makiza Latifa and I want to say thank you for spending your morning with us here. See you same time next week.